work session to order. We'll do introductions and then hopefully Dean will be ready. Starting with Mr. Peterson.
B. Peterson.
Meg Zalaton.
Forrest Dunbar.
Felix Rivera. And then we have Dean Gates, Assembly Council. And then do we have any organizations here today that are going to be speaking before us? If you could introduce yourselves, please.
My name is Randy Sarkey. I'm with the Alaska Trappers Association.
Thank you.
My name is Tom Lessard, and I'm with the Trappers Association.
Thank you. Okay. Yes, sir.
And I'm Neil Taylor. I'm a supporter of the traffic ordinance, but I'm not within an organization.
Sure. Thank you.
Eugene Carl, even to represent myself.
Thank you, Eugene. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Peterson to give we've also been joined by Mr. Franks. Mr. Peterson to give a brief introduction and then turn it over to Mr. Gates.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. We did a couple of updates from the original version, and so we just passed out an S version that Dean had just finished recently. And if you look at the Assembly memorandum, that will give you some bullet points as to areas that were discussed at the last work session that we thought might need some adjusting. And so we've done that. And so I'll let Dean get into the legal details of the S version. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Peterson. So, as Mr. Peterson is pointing out, then we try to explain these changes. So, that first one, and I need to correct myself on our last work session. I said that we have the exact same language as the state regulation. Let me know if I need to speak up, all right? And interrupt me if you have questions and some numbers. The state regulation didn't actually have those three words describing it. And so I'm not sure where I got that misconception from when I was drafting 3 months ago. I decided about that last session. And I want to correct that now. So the state regulation is almost the same, except it doesn't have one use. And I think the effort was intended to recognize that not just the large main use trails, but other trails that are commonly used by hikers and their pets would be included. But there are, I guess, some particular difficulties trying to enforce something like that and trying to identify use trail for that definition. And I think to insulate against those challenges and that confusion, best to just include use trail. So it isn't exactly like the state regulation that applies in each state court. And so that would be, I guess, if we're looking down the ordinance, the definition of ground trail is also changed.
If I can just interrupt you.
That is intended to.
I'm sorry, just really briefly, just want to put into the record, we've been joined by Ms. Quinn Davidson and also Mr. Dyson and Mr. Perez-Verdia will not be able to join us for this work session. I don't think Mr. Dyson will be able to join us for any of the work sessions today. Mr. Perez-Verdia will be joining us later this afternoon. Go ahead, Mr. Gates.
No problem. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So on page 3 of this new draft substitute version, the new trail is changed really good as well. It's meant to use new offshoot trails. Offshoot trails is a term that borrowed from the Skagway ordinance that Skagway has an ordinance. I wanted to show it to you really easy. And then you have definition for offshoot trails. I think this fits well and creates a better balance between, I guess, in traffic activities. If you walk the main trail, you're actually within the trail yourself. We don't want to create confusion as to what's an offshoot trail, it's mainstay trail. I think this creates a better distinction between where that zone is going to be and less confusion about these trails and so forth and which ones are those. So I think this is clear that a trail that has a parking area, it's graded, has a sign, identifying there's a trail here, and it's clearly it's going to be at the trailhead. That the main stem of that trailhead is where the buffer zone applies, not all the offshoot trails down the way and I was down So that was the intent here of making these changes by deleting the definition for public use trail and modifying the definition for developed trail. So the buffer zone, prohibited buffer zone language itself only changes by the word public use trail instead adds the excluded off-use trails. So looking at page 2, lines 48. So the next change, I guess I just run down the ordinance document at the bottom of page 2, subsection B is section that says the assembly can establish a list of event trails by resolution, and Skyway is something similar. And we heard from the attorney for the Department of Fish and Game, the Assistant Attorney General, Ms. Brookings. She mentioned that system worked much better for the Department of Fish and Game. That was a recommendation that we try to do something similar to that. So that's my intent here is to create best fiction to stay from the department and then tracking the rights that there are. I added though at the top of page 3 that area to use the trail doesn't disqualify it from having a zone on the trail. But I think that is okay. I think the purpose of at least would be more for public information and be clear. But the definition of a developed trail is that the parking area is graded, signage, and a main stream you can identify. And so that's why I don't want to disqualify trails. They don't used to the website. So the next change
Just
is
interrupt you really quick. I just want to put in the record that we've been joined by Mr. Wood. Thank you, Mr. Gates.
It's just a little language change to subsection C, the top of page 3, just for clarification that are set within the municipality. And so subsection D is an exception we talked about last time that we wanted to have for officials engaged in their official activities, within the control, some understandings with South Animals and so forth. We don't want to bring that. So the official engaged in land control, so that's something we cover. And then I mentioned changing the definitions of trail, which also the definition of washing.
Yeah, sorry. I think this will be the last time I think. Also want to put into the record that we've been joined by Ms. Kennedy. Thank you.
Okay. One little change. It's deleting the word wild, and that's on page 5 and page 6 in the middle. I had originally written wild or game animals, and these permitting pointed out this because wild and game. And for purposes of this, we refer a lot to the Department of Fish and Game regulations, which is game animals, and that's what we trap. They can't trap other animals. So just really wild and the inclusion consistent with language that still uses. I also page 6 added in section that the traveling animals that's already in our code as a crime. It doesn't apply for purposes of border control, and I think that is going to actually change that. This is still not just border control. I think it wasn't just limited to rodents. Some people mentioned other types of nuisance animals that we would want to not have supply to. I think that would still fall under an exception for officials and official activities. So I don't think we have private folks who not know. You don't want this to apply to abstract and so forth. I get that from the last book session. I actually don't see that situation being that much concern, but that's in for those buffer zones. That this is mainly established for crime and type of thing. This is about buffer zones. It's dropping in the municipality. And so we have that exception so people can set their mouse tracks, for example.
Mr. Gates, I guess I have a question for you real quick. Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Oh, I can let you, I guess I'll just go for it. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I guess I have sort of an overarching question of how broadly broadly this will be applicable. So we have a lot of state land and some federal lands in the city. How is this gonna apply and what does it actually do? And then, for instance, like in section A, you're talking about, I mean, there could be like Chugach State Park trailheads, but I'm assuming we can't regulate what happens if trapping is permitted there. So how does that work? And then I have other questions, but maybe we'll start there.
That specific, I didn't talk about the trailhead, I just talked about Chugach State Park. Some areas of Chugach State Park, trapping is allowed, but in all those areas, you should then know has regulations, which is the same language that I'm adopting in section A. That doesn't really answer your question, but I was about to get to that point as well, as to how this is applied to all the various lands and different landowners out there. So in the AM, at the bottom of the second page, that side, I talk about that a little bit. But basically, I'm pointing this to enforcement and implementation. I think that there's no reason this couldn't go into our code, but you may not be able to enforce on federal lands until you have some consent from the federal government. You'll have consent for animal control and control enforcement on federal land here. And I don't see any reason why we couldn't maybe obtain, as it's up to the federal government to say so. Same type of consent, but that might be a necessary step to do on implementation with the ordinance. There was also that statement that you mentioned. I think that this applies, but I can see that the assistant attorney general disagree, and the intent here, that's important, just legislative intent and open purpose, is protecting people and their pets who are hunting. It's not to regulate trapping, and that's everybody, so you can't put a trap here and regulating trapping. And that, I guess, is really the main issue of contention. I think that I'm pointing it to enforcement. You know, I believe that political enforcement would probably get advice or ask for, it would be wise to ask our Department of Law for advice on that. And I'm a member of the community citation. And then that's appealed, we have a course of comprehensive jurisdiction telling us no, that's so forth. It's a very complicated issue, and I did some research since the last Worksession. I don't have a real clear answer one way or the other. It is true that the states got rights for regulating hunting and trapping, fishing, and those natural resources. It doesn't say that municipalities can't regulate trail use and safety of trail use or so I don't know exactly how that would play out. I'm not a court competent jurisdiction that can make some kind of declaration. So I'm anti-action. And was I had one more piece. So people also mentioned some subsistence property activities. And I see that similarly to the state's regulation of hunting. We're not regulating subsistence activities, we're regulating where the safety of the trail. Can we do that on criminal lands? Was a question asked last time. I'm not sure, but I would recommend that on implementation for numbers enforcement there about the administration can get consent from criminal or they recognize their rights. That's a really complicated issue as well.
So just so I make sure I understand, are you suggesting that the municipality can set public safety rules even on state lands?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Davidson. Anything else, Mr. Gates?
Well, I was going to show you what Skyway did. I'm not sure if that's necessarily about an ordinance. It just looks like an ordinance. They have they named a few areas in the buffer zone. They also said you can name trails by resolution. They later adopted a resolution that named these specific trails and have a map showing where they were.
Sure, Mr. Jumper.
The Skagway ordinance, the trails that you mentioned, the buffer zones they created, Were those on state land, on federal land, on private land, on a combination?
Good question, but my understanding was that was Skyway and Skyway schools. So Skyway's municipal parks. They're different though because they're second class municipality, number one, second class below. There are home rules, so they don't have the same home rule powers that municipality has. And that's all legislative powers not prohibited by law or trouble. So if we see what prohibited by law, and like I said, that's a real complicated question. I think it's a fair question. So I can't guarantee that we're not prohibiting this. And I'm sure some people here will argue that we are prohibiting. I think that in the intent for public safety purposes that would be valid. There's a presumption of validity for the legislative acts that the same passes in the state statute. But of course, challenge those and prevail or overcome that presumption.
Yeah, I'll put you back on the queue. Anything else, Mr. Dunbar? Okay, thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Peterson.
I was going to mention one other thing about the Skyway ordinance. So they passed their ordinance. I'm not sure if we covered that at the last session. This is in 22. Brookings contacted me and sent in a letter restricting a copy. I think will help in the state. It has sole authority to regulate issues. And I read it. I'm still not convinced of as I'm not quite sure. I think it's still debatable. But she recommended that Skyway bring her ordinance the way it was written, rather than need some changes. But bring it to the Board of Game and as a proposed regulation, and ask the Board of Game to adopt that as a regulation that was also in the Skyway Municipal Code. So she informed me earlier this week that Board of Game denied that proposal. So that's where that ended up. I would suggest that we might want to do the same thing. I see some issues with the Skyway proposal that aren't in this ordinance. For example, Skyway had several provisions about the particular type of truck, height above the ground. It was a little more specific, I think. And I haven't read the record of the game, but I believe those issues probably out. And then we saw it as a version on the regulation of the trucking gear and stuff, which we're not trying to do. And I guess on that note, I should mention again that the one, I think, area where this proposed ordinance might touch on regulating gear is with following some form of identification of the owner would be marked on tracks. However, I think that's reasonable and necessary requirement in order to even enforce the validity of they're not standing by tracks. You have to identify them somehow. They already have that requirement in each state. So I think that would be okay, but it would be a lot stronger if that were adopted by the beginning of the regulation. I think I'm done.
All right, thank you, Mr. Gates. So I have Mr. Peterson, Ms. Quinn Davidson, and Mr. Constein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to mention that instead of listing all the trails that are going to be affected by this ordinance in the ordinance, we decided that it would be better to list those in a resolution. That way, as additional trails are added in future years, we could add those by resolution instead of having to amend the ordinance. And so that's the reason behind doing that.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question was actually about Section B, so thanks for speaking about me. It seems to me a little strange to say we can list developed trails by resolution, but if they're not listed, that's fine too. How is that helpful to the public? Right, failure to list a trail that otherwise meets the definition does not mean, I mean, it's a little confusing, but it doesn't mean that you can trap there. So why even list them at all?
Well, I would say first, I'm comfortable to be not in which is still a draft, that the sense of the world around here, that I'm comfortable doing that. My thought in adding is, well, it's nice to the public, to have at least spitting down on the website. I'm gonna walk my dog here because it's on the list. So on the list, I'm gonna avoid it. But, then when it comes to enforcement, if there at least wouldn't be like, forcing citation.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson. Mr. Constant.
Well, and that question sparks another question, is maybe a better strategy is to designate some department within the municipality, department head, the Department of Health, or Public Safety to be the designator of trails. And then they can publish a list on a regular basis that doesn't require us to get in, but we can then make a recommendation if we need to. And in that way, it becomes an executive action instead of a legislative effort. So maybe we can clean that up. But you mentioned, Dean, that traps in the Chugach State Park already have to have some kind of identification on them.
By state regulation, yeah. They
So does-
require the trappers to get an ID number from the superintendent of the whole, if I have that correct.
But having a number, but are you saying then they're required to have their traps marked with that number?
Yes. that's
Okay,
what
so
it is.
then, is it currently the law then, if there is a trap that's set that doesn't have ID on it, that trap is somehow subject to confiscation?
This doesn't touch on confiscating.
No, I understand what this is, but I mean, the current status of the law, if they're already required to have a number on them, what happens if they don't have a number on them?
I don't know what if some of the states are doing. I'm not sure about that.
No, thank you.
I want to mention the first part, talk about perhaps the states and the admin, designated trails, what do you think about this resolution, some of the actions you have to take, the process that wants to travelers and everyone wants to have some good steps as well as.
I can appreciate that, and maybe there's some annual review of that list, but it seems a more flexible methodology would be to have an executive department head, especially someone dealing with public safety or health, which is what we're talking about here, not regulation of traps, but regulation of the public safety within the public sphere. Someone who has that as their job, however we get there.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So 2 questions, and by way of clarification, and I believe we covered this a bit in the first work session. Looking at the map, Mr. Gates, so the area in red is closed to trapping, and this is a fish and game map, correct? And so some of the areas.
Yeah, this is.
Okay. So some of these areas outside here wouldn't be your Chugach State Park land.
Yes, that's fine. I have not stressed it, it's not overlaid, but you go.
And it's possible those areas could be open for trapping. And so the rules that are proposed in section A, the 50 yards of developed trails, 1/4 mile of trailheads, those are the rules that are used when trapping is open in the Chugach, right? I think we had
That's
said
correct.
that before.
That's how I see it.
Okay, so that's great. And then the second question is, do roads fit into this at all? As far as there needing to be a buffer?
I'm sorry, Mr. Franks, I apologize. You mentioned that last time. I didn't look down into
Oh,
this.
that's okay.
I would assume we need to include some kind of, I have the answer and it's just a little street. I'm not sure where I'm at. But I'm going to assume that we need to, not expressly include ordinance or some, there might be more familiar with that.
Mr. Chair, is it okay to ask?
Sure. Yeah.
Is there anyone here who might be able to address the issue of if trapping is permitted near roads when an area is open to trapping?
Yeah,
Chair?
if anyone in the public has an answer, go ahead, sir. And if you could say your name for the record.
My name's Tom Lassard, and in general, yes, it is open to traffic along roads.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Prince. Ms. Zolotow.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the offshoot trail definition. Would it be fair, so if someone's cited for trapping within the buffer zone, it would be an affirmative defense then for them to argue it was an offshoot trail and not a developed trail?
The main stem trail is still got that 50-yard buffer zone, so you know, from 50 yards up an offshoot trail, and for 25 yards up an offshoot trail, you're still within that buffer zone next to the main stem.
So, if I may, so if someone's cited and they're told they were on a developed trail, but they don't believe it was a developed trail, it wasn't listed, that would be something they could basically use to contest their ticket? Because this is a concern that the trappers I've heard via email is that they're going to be potentially putting a trap near a trail that isn't developed in their minds, or that they're gonna, every trail that they use then becomes like a developed trail. So I just want to get clarification on that.
Well, our enforcement officers and police officers who sign on this, they're well trained in making sure that they have a clear idea of what we're signing for. And I think that I'm positive that across this, that's really the issue.
Thank you, Ms. Zolotow. Mr. Dunbar.
And I apologize if it's in here, I'm missing it, but who do we envision as the enforcement officers in this case? We don't have city fish and game officers. So for you, Dean, or for Mr. Peterson.
What I see, this is in Tab 14, and that's the regulations. APD has general law enforcement powers, but inside of you still this is being probably more complaint driven. So pets caught in their trap, they home. I'm not sure who it was. I actually sent this question to Mr. Fawson's manager and forwarded it to several department heads. And with some thought,
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Ms. LaFrancs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Going back to the point about developed trails, for clarification, Mr. Gates, I mean, under the definition, it says, okay, any trail or footpath designated under statute or marked sign or designated by the municipality. It would seem that would address the concern that any trail would become a designated trail, because it seems like it's actually an involved process to achieve that status. If it's under statute or marked with an official sign. May I address that to Ms. Zolotow? I mean, in terms of the responses and feedback that you've been receiving about that, the concern is that there'll be signs and additional trails designated.
If I may, Mr. Chair. Yeah, basically we'll see that this is a frequently used footpath trail, and then it will be basically, which is typically used by trappers, and then it will be then go, oh, well, that should be a designated trail because it's got all the other, everything but the signage. And I think we get down kind of a bit of a rabbit hole on it, because if you think about some of the trails we go on, we have a designated trailhead, we start down the trail, and then they split. And they're obviously well-developed trails, and I think there's just some confusion about where are we going to end up on this, because what is an secondary unmarked trail with less frequent usage. So what I've heard in some of the comments is, well, what if we use this trail all the time? So it's going to appear to be quite a developed trail. And so I'm just making sure that's really clear, because it may come off of an official trailhead. It's just, I think it's going to be an enforcement issue, and I think it's going to take some time to probably flesh out. I think the intent is that they're not going to create their own trails, but I think that's one of the concerns that I know it is one of the concerns I'm getting via email.
Thank you, Mr. Ferris. Thank you, Ms. Solotel. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And there, we have a ton of trails in the Anchorage Borough. Some of them are named, some of them are marked, some of them have main trailheads. Some of them don't. In my neighborhood, we had 27 acres that was the old greenhouse property that was in limbo for a couple decades. And so everyone started using that as a de facto park to walk their dogs in. And so there's a bunch of established trails there, but none of those trails are named. But I mean, that area actually is in the municipality of Anchorage, the city. And so trapping in that area has been banned since, decades ago. But so there are a lot of trails that are established. You can see that people have been walking on this trail for years or decades or whatever. Even if it doesn't officially have a name, I would think it would qualify as a trail in this ordinance.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. All right. Seeing no further questions, thank you, Mr. Gates. I'll go ahead and turn it over to the Trappers Association. I don't know if either of you want to speak or both of you.
You want us to come up?
Yeah, if you could come up just so the recorder gets it better, and then say your name for the record. So did you get a chance to look at this S version? You might have just gotten it today, I'm not sure.
Yeah, been browsing it as you've all been talking, but I'd rather pay attention to what's being said. So, my name is Randy Zarnke. I'm from Fairbanks. I'm the president of the Alaska Trappers Association. And here today representing our more than 900 members, 150 of whom live in the area here. It should come as no surprise to you that we're opposed to the ordinance. The state constitution gives the authority to regulate trapping to the Board of Game, not to local governments. And that message has been shared with you folks from both our attorney and the Assistant Attorney General, who was here a week ago or 10 days ago, whenever that was. Now, there are a few things, we don't dispute that you folks can regulate any activity on land that you own, but it's the other state, federal land within your perimeter that we dispute some of the actions you're proposing to take. For example, the ID tag on traps, the Board of Game specifically prohibited that a couple of years ago, and so for you to impose it kind of ignores the Board of Game process. It's also really false to suggest that there's really any health threat to humans from trapping activities. I know of no incidents in the history of this state where any human has been caught in any trap. In our minds, this ordinance is really a cure in search of a problem. There have been very few reports each year of dogs getting caught in traps, but I have seen an article that says there are over 500 cases of people getting bitten by dogs. A neutral observer might conclude that you're really focusing on the wrong problem. If you were to enforce the leash law, then both of the problems with dog bites and animals getting caught in traps would be diminished, if not eliminated. In terms of alternative suggestions for you folks, one would be what I just mentioned, to enforce the leash law. Up in Fairbanks several years ago, we developed a program that we refer to as the mutual voluntary approach. We have posted signs in key places around the borough where we know that there have been conflicts in the past, and it basically says, we, the Trappers Association, recommend that no traps or snares be set in this area. And the other half of the equation is that we advise people that trapping season is open from this date to that date, and to control your dogs during those times. So it puts the onus on both sides of the question. And if you'll work with us, we'd like to try something similar here, and then go to the Board of Game with a proposal, which in our minds is the proper way to do it. Don't adopt your own ordinance and then ask the Board of Game to endorse it. That was what Skagway tried, and it was rejected by the Board of Game. If there's support from our group as well as all the other user groups that might be represented, we believe there'd be a greater likelihood of approval by the Board of Game. I guess that's all I had.
Thank you. I have some questions for you. Ms. Solotel.
They just passed those signs that they flashed so we could take a closer look at them. That was my question.
request.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Mr. Wells.
I got a couple of questions you might be able to answer. So, you know, I mean, a lot of this is trapping's not allowed, but we have two big drainages where it is. Why are those allowed? How were those chosen?
I think Tom would probably be a better person to answer that, because that was done before I was really.
Okay, so I'll wait on that. Can I ask a few? So why no ID on the trap? Why was that?
Pardon me?
It used to, ID on traps used to be required, but no longer.
There have been instances, including with people on our board of directors, where traps have been stolen and then set illegally. In other words, if my trap is out there with a tag on it and some opponent of trapping can steal that trap, set it illegally, and then if there's a trap ID tag on it, I get blamed for it. And that has actually happened to people. It's not just a hypothetical.
Why did they do that?
Pardon me?
Why did they do that?
To give trappers a bad name.
So within Chugach State Park, where trapping's allowed, you're required, you can't set traps within 50 yards of the trail. Is that correct?
That's
Is that-
my understanding, and that was a process that involved the Board of Game.
Okay. But is that a problem? I don't know anything about trapping, but it seems like you don't want traps near trails because you got people there scaring the critters
Yep.
away. So is it, I mean, 50 yards, it's a whole huge mountain range out there. It seems like we're really just impacting the sliver.
Yeah, when you start creating corridors along paths and calculating the percentage of a large area that you're impacting, it adds up pretty fast. You know, at one point we calculated that there was a proposal to close trapping along the Iditarod Trail, and I don't remember what the setback was anymore, but you start calculating it, and it's in the hundreds of thousands of acres if you create a corridor along the trail. Luckily, that one was just.
So is 50 yards from a trail, is that pretty good traffic usually? Or is it, well, you really don't want to be there anyway?
It depends on the area where you're in. Maybe Tom can address that a little bit more.
I think we've. I'm fine with that. And then, it's okay if I got a short list, but even so, some of the emails we got, there's different kinds of trapping. So the big scary ones, maybe have those further away, but apparently some are underneath the ice in a river or something like that. I mean, is there a way to distinguish? Like maybe those are okay and others aren't. Have you seen?
Yeah, very definitely. You know, most of the trapping, to just follow up on some of your examples, most of the trapping for beaver takes place under the ice. You know, that would pose no threat at all to any humans or other animals in the area. The other example that's used quite often is that generally marten traps, and marten is one of the most preferred furs for everyone, they're oftentimes set above the ground quite a distance, I mean 4 or 5 feet above the ground. And once again, that would eliminate really any threat.
Like in a tree?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Woods. Any further questions? Seeing none, thank you. Yes, sir.
Again, my name is Tom Lassard, and you've covered a lot of ground here, Mr. Chair. Thank you. So I was kind of glad to see the version S, because you're trying to focus down on some trails. Before it was pretty general, and there was some discussion earlier about concerns that Assembly member had gotten from trappers about how the trail is defined, and I've heard some discussion. It's like, well, if you're walking up a public trail, maintained trailhead or something, some designated trail, and then this trapper, he's trapping in the winter typically, so maybe he has on snowshoes. Now he goes off, and now here's another trail, clearly laid, obviously well used, that people would tend to go down. Dogs would run down, and so I think that was part of what the concern was, just to add a little clarification there. But 50 yards either side of the trail, that's a 100-yard corridor. A quarter-mile setback is a half-mile radius circle. And how would that be measured? There's a lot of terrain involved. Is this a straight line measurement? Take a tape measure from the center line of the trail straight up to...
Shortest pedestrian route, yeah.
Shortest pedestrian route, okay.
No, sorry,
I'm sorry, because I think that there's concern, sort of an analogous situation with setbacks for bear baiting. And I believe that the state troopers use just a flat ground GPS type measurement. So if the trail is here and there's something a quarter mile up the hill, straight line distance, if you look at it as a flat map of GPS, it's only maybe 300 yards instead of 440. So there's a lot of technicalities here. How far do you want these? I mean, if somebody, you know, there's slope considerations. Of course, we would like to see this go through the Board of Game, and there was some mention earlier about Skagway being denied by the Board of Game. And my understanding is that the Board of Game cycles every 3 years for specific areas: southeast, interior, south central. And so I believe, if I have this correct, the Skagway proposal would have been out of order. And so the request was for the board to consider this under an emergency contingency, and they said, well, it doesn't seem to be a big emergency. So that could be why the board rejected that, but I'm not sure. I'm just trying to help clarify if that's a point.
If I just, what I understood from Brookings was Skagway proposed their regulation like 1 year ago, but Board of Game in Virginia in January meeting to from out of Virginia southeast. So I think it was on the record. She sent me an email, just the short sentence, Board of Game didn't approve the regulation. So I shouldn't say why. So we could probably guess. I don't really know the exact reason.
And I may be speaking out of turn on that as well. I'm not sure. I think Mr. Zarnke was actually at the meeting. He may know exactly what happened with Skagway, if that is a point that you want to keep continuing on. Because, I mean, I think it is important, if you do decide to go to the Board of Game, to find out exactly what they are willing to, you know, hear. And I think they would be completely open to something like this. Like was mentioned, you know, we don't have any problem with the assembly here doing whatever you want on municipal owned land. There's no contest there as to what you're able to do. But also, like was stated, the public safety issue, it's dogs and traps. It is. It's loose dogs and traps, dogs that are off leash. And we all know that there's already leash laws here. And so you've got certain rules being disregarded, and now it's going to lay over on other users who are following current regulations. I could go on, but you know, I mean, bikes, baseballs, and dog bites are a lot more dangerous than these traps are to human beings. And again, I think you've seen pictures come in of some big traps killing dogs, and there are some traps that will do that. And these are basically designed for beaver, wolverine, and stuff. A lot of times they're set under the ice, but sometimes people set these traps in places they shouldn't be, and so nobody wants a dead dog. And again, you know, there's traps and then there's traps. So if there was some process with the Board of Game, we would be glad to help. Try to define some of these things, like up trees, under ice. There's traps that are set in enclosed boxes with little holes like this that pose a threat to nobody except, you know, a weasel or a squirrel. And I guess that's pretty much all I've got to say.
Thank you, sir. So I have some questions. Ms. Olitz.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Chair, I am curious what you think, as someone who's here in Anchorage or in the Anchorage area, about ID tags on traps. I know that we heard about, you know, some concerns that it's a way to catch, or there could be some malfeasance, but I could see as well where it could be valuable, even if there wasn't, you know, the full ordinance, so that if there was an incident with the trap, someone would have a set of contact information.
And that's what it is. It's contact information. Trap tags prove nothing without cameras or something, you know, without direct evidence. If a trooper, you know, if there's a trap tag regulation, let's say, and I'm talking state trooper finds a trap that's supposed to have a tag, all he could do is go and say, here's this trap without a tag. Is this yours?
So,
Or
what are your thoughts about having, like, basically a name and phone number on the trap, you know, so that way if, I mean, one, you just said sometimes trappers might set them in like undesirable locations that could cause an adverse interaction. I mean, as another trapper, if you found it with the tag, you could call that trapper up and say, hey,
What are you doing?
What are you doing? Yeah, so a little bit of self-policing. Also, then if there was an adverse interaction, then there would be some information for the person involved in that interaction to have.
Again, trap tags prove nothing by themselves. The person would have to admit to it if that was all that the trooper and enforcement had to go on. They would have to say, you know, we found this trap here with your tag on it. What's the deal? It's not mine. It was stolen. I don't know anything about it. So it proves nothing on its own. But beyond that, I think what the problem is with trap tags, and I think the problem that the Board of Games specifically had, was that it becomes a primary enforcement tool. And a lot of these traps are set to conceal them from animals. And so you've got this carefully made set, and then there's a little trap tag maybe that's attached to the trap. And so when there's a trap tag regulation, the enforcement officer comes and says, well, here's a trap set. I don't see any identification. So now he starts messing with it, and he picks up the trap to see if there's a tag. And then he tries to put it back, and now he's just fouled up this trap set. And so it interferes with the trapper's trapping directly when it's used as a direct enforcement tool, and that's what it becomes. A lot of times the troopers will say, well, we just want it in case we find a trap out of season or some other problem like this, which seems to make perfect sense. And it does, but when they go up and they take that trap and mess with it, now they're messing with the trapper's ability to catch something. So that's a big problem. That's why a lot of trappers don't like it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hanson. On the subject?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure, Mr. Lefebvre.
Then how can they enforce any of these regulations? I mean, how do they identify? There's no way to identify when we register all kinds of things. You know, we have, if there's no tag or any other kind of ID, how can they do any kind of enforcement action on trappers?
I can give you a specific example, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
I trapped down on the Kenai Peninsula, and an area that I was trapping, somebody else started trapping there, and I thought, who is this? Because usually trappers try to stay away from each other. And so I was curious who it was, so I set up a game camera, and I actually got some pictures of two guys trapping. And so I didn't know who they were, and so that was that. And then the end of the season came and went, and I just kind of went about my business, and I sort of forgot about them. My phone rings in March. The season ended in January. It's the state troopers. And they know that I trap this area because I have to tag fur bearers. You know, when I catch animals, there's certain species that I have to take to Fish and Game and register with them. So they already have an oblique system for figuring out where trappers have been in the past. So, and like I say, most trappers try not to overlap. So they know that I trapped a certain area. So when they found a trap that was set out of season, that actually had an animal in it, they called me. And I said, that's not mine. I said, it's this kind of a set. I know what it is. I said, I've got pictures of these guys. He said, you got pictures? And I said, yes. So I sent them the pictures, and they couldn't figure out who it was. And so I found out months later that they were having trouble. They were going to put an ad in the paper with this picture, saying, does anybody recognize these guys? So I kind of put out the word with the trappers, and I sent the pictures out myself. Once I turned it over to the troopers, I backed off. So anyway, long story short, within a couple of days, one of the trappers said, I know these guys, and they're bad actors. They're such and such. So I gave that information to the state troopers, and they got them. So there are ways to do it. It requires on-the-ground legwork, and I believe what happened prior to that is that state parks had gone out, because my question was, how did they find this trap? After it snowed and everything, there was no way to find it. I think what had happened is the state parks people had gone out and found, they saw trappers trails going off into the woods, and they found these and marked them with a GPS. And then sometime after the season, they just went back and kind of spot check it, and they found a problem, turned it over to the troopers. So there are ways to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lefebvre. Mr. Wilson.
Okay, a couple. So why are these two drainages carved out so you can't trap there?
That happened back in the 70s, I think. That was before my time. But what is that, Eagle River? Yeah, that's Eagle River and Eklutna. You know, I think mainly it was part of Chugach State Park. And so there was probably, and I don't know for sure. I'm guessing it was a compromise.
I didn't know if it was like, because that's really good trapping area or something.
Well, it is a good trapping area, the areas that are closed. But, you know,
Areas that are closed are better, or?
well, like Eklutna, I know is really a popular trapping area, the upper Eklutna area.
So when you say that you kind of within the trapping groups, you stay away from each other's trap lines. I mean, what would be kind of a respectable distance?
That varies. I mean, along the road system, it's sort of acknowledged that it's sort of a free-for-all within a mile or two.
Physically a road.
Yes, but when you start to get off into the wilderness areas, it's hard to find things. It's just sort of a gentleman's thing. No, miles.
Miles. Just say miles away.
Trap line here, trap line over here, 5-10 miles away maybe. Some people argue 5 miles is too close, but this is very well established, especially in the interior areas. It's not by law though. By state law, it's all open to everybody for their common use. So.
Well, I mean, we're asking for 50 yards, and you're saying amongst yourselves, you say stay miles away from each other. So you are really restricting each other. This law was restricting.
That's true, but people are still using it. And the 50-yard setback on the trail doesn't seem like much, but it's all about access. Well, because you're walking down a trail, why does everybody go down the trail? Because it's the easy way in. You've got brush, you've got trees, you've got terrain, mountains, canyons. That's where people travel. It's why you don't drive in the ditch instead of driving on the highway. You know, it's how you get around.
But then you just walk 50 feet off.
50 yards, 50 feet, yeah.
50 yards. Say you're traveling, is that?
Takes a lot of time. Daylight's short in the winter. Trapping seasons are, you know, not all year round either. They're just a few months of the year.
When?
Generally November through January or February for most land trapping.
Thank you, Mr. Wells. So I have Ms. LaFrance, Mr. Hunston, Mr. Dunbar, and then I think we have to wrap this up. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just want to point on the signs that were passed around. Whatever happens with this ordinance, I mean, I hope that those do get posted in this area because I think that's a great idea. I also had a request from someone that maybe some instructions on how to handle a trap if an animal gets caught in them would also be helpful. And then second, it was my understanding that in some parts of the Chugach, as far as leash laws go, it's permitted to have one's dog off leash. And I don't know if Mr. Gates or Mr. Peterson has clarification.
I believe that they require a non-leash short.
A what?
They require a leash 9 feet short.
9 feet or shorter? Okay.
Chugach State Park.
Okay, well, maybe we can come back to that one later. And then my final point was just on the topic of education, because some of the feedback I've heard from members of the trapping community is, you know, don't go this route, let's focus on education. And I don't see these things as necessarily mutually exclusive, though to the point about without IDs on traps, it would be hard to know who are the trappers who need education. And I know we're almost out of time, and I would be curious as far as like what kinds of education is required. And we talked about that a little bit in the last work session. But you know, why are there some bad actors? There probably always will be. But how can the number of folks who aren't aware of the rules be mitigated? I guess this is more follow-up stuff we should share. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Hunston.
Thank you. So when you talked about trapping near the road, you used the frame of about a mile. So in that mile, that's like I would guess from your use of that frame, kind of an easy access area. And it becomes less easy access as you get further away, so you have fewer people to do it, right?
Yes.
Fair assumption. And so, if a mile is easy access, doesn't 50 yards seem to be pretty slim in the context of a mile?
I would say it has to do more with volume of trappers, especially if you're talking about areas within, the area, say 100 miles of Fairbanks or Anchorage or Kenai or something like this.
But doesn't that in some ways add to the consideration, at least, that some special characteristics, rules of order might be in order within a very tight area of a high density of users?
I won't argue with that. I won't go to the mat with you on that, but I would still reiterate that, the proper way to do this outside of municipal lands is with the Board of Game process, and we'd be happy to work with you guys to hammer out some of these points because it does get technical. It's a can of worms, and you understand there's a lot of layers here.
I think that's a legal theory. I think the legal theory being organized here is that it's more of a public safety and health and other issues for us. Understand for you guys it's a Board of Game issue, but we don't have a correlation to the Board of Game. We regulate the health and safety and the public use of our lands and those lands that are within our jurisdiction. So I understand the question of jurisdiction is ultimately the question.
Thank you, Mr. Constable. Mr. Dunbar.
Yeah, I think the question of jurisdiction will be litigated. I actually think Anchorage is a fairly strong case within our borders. We have dual jurisdiction on these things, and we had this conversation last time. The Board of Game regulates hunting, but we can still ban the discharge of a firearm in our city limits. But regardless, the questions I have for you, so I guess the questions for the sponsor I do want to know more about the leash law in Chugach State Park. I'm actually curious about that. Because if it is the case that everywhere, so you look at the red map here, so practically speaking, what we think of as the core of Anchorage is already close to traffic. So what we're really talking about are some of the places that move out to Chugach State Park. And if there is a strong leash law that says you must be on a leash at all times, then to me the question is sort of settled. But okay, do you have
Sorry,
the answer?
thank you, Mr. Chair. On the DNR Alaska Gov site, it says that pets are welcome at state parks and campgrounds with leash and accompanied by the owner at all times. Unleashed dogs are allowed in the backcountry, but must be within voice command. So
Okay.
backcountry.
So I guess I need to know the definition of backcountry because Chugach State Park, even close to Anchorage, might be backcountry, it might not. I grew up in Cordova, and everything in this area is not backcountry to me, but you can still get lost and die out there pretty quickly. So the other question I have, and it's for you, and it gets back to what Mr. Costa was saying. So imagine we have a fairly tight definition of what a developed trail is. So, it's things that are pretty obvious, that have a name, that in a lot of cases are even paved for a portion, and there are main trails. And we say, on these main trails, 50 feet from either side, would that actually
50
impact,
yards.
sorry, 50 yards. Would that actually impact many trappers? Are there trappers, I guess another way to say this, are there trappers right now that are setting traps within 50 yards of our largest developed trails?
I don't know about in the municipality, but there are trappers that set well within 50 yards. Mr. Chair, can I do something real quick here?
Sure.
I brought some stuff here, and
Randy was talking about a trap being on a tree. This is a typical marten set, perhaps. There would be a trap inside this box. And so you've got the big dog killing type traps that you've probably all seen pictures of. Here's a smaller trap right here, within 50 yards of a trail. This thing is not a problem. It's not a public safety issue. So there's traps and then there's traps. That's my point.
But so your short answer is yes. You think that there are trappers right now for some of our larger trails that are setting within 50 yards of that trail?
In the municipality?
In the borders of the municipality which extend into Chugach State Park.
And Chugach National Forest, not just the state park.
Sure, I mean,
and that's kind of
we're the size of Rhode Island.
And that's kind of what we're talking about here. Just as a point of clarification, we're talking about areas outside of Chugach State Park. We're talking about Chugach National Forest.
Okay.
Because the state park already has these setbacks.
Within the borders of the municipality of Anchorage.
Yes, there are trappers that are trapping within 50 yards of trails. Yes.
thank you. Any last comments, Mr. Peterson?
You have anything, John, did you have?
No, no, thank you.
Okay, we're good.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we'll go ahead and thank you so much.
Yep, thank you.
That was our first work session. We're going to take about 5 minutes.